Hi, everybody. So today we are going to be looking at a really important topic that we want to timeline from early in American history all the way through period 7 for the AP test. And that is religion. Now, obviously, there's no way that I'm going to be able to cover all of religion in American history. And so what I'm going to instead focus on today is the history more of religious revivals and how they dramatically shaped things that came afterwards in American history. So there have been three major religious revivals in the time frame that we need to know for the AP test. The first religious revival is going to be happening in the 1730s in the Colonial Period, which we refer to as the First Great Awakening. The second religious revival is going to be happening in the early 1800s that we call the Second Great Awakening. And then we're going to talk about one last religious revival in the Gilded Age, which we're going to refer to as the social gospel movement. And so we're going to talk a little bit about how these major revivals of religion had a huge impact on the development of the United States over time. So before we get into these religious revivals, I want to at least give us some background on the development of religion in America during the colonial period. So from the get-go in American history, religion was an important driving force for why people came to the colonies and to the United States. And we see this from the very beginning in American history. We've got some of the first people coming into what eventually becomes the United States, coming here for religious freedom. So in, for example, the 1600s, you got in 1620, the Pilgrims coming into and settling the area that is now like New England, and they're establishing the Plymouth Colony, and they're separatists. They're coming because they want to break away from the Church of England, which they see as corrupt. Following them in 1630 is the Puritans, who shared a lot of the same values as the Pilgrims. They also saw the Church of England as corrupt. But rather than want to separate and break away from the Church of England, they still saw themselves a part of that institution and instead wanted to reform it. And they felt that the best way to reform it was to come to America and to create a new beacon for religion here in the colonies, what they refer to as the city upon a hill, which was this idea that they would serve as almost role models for reform within the Church of England. And so they were hoping to, kind of demonstrate to the world how to practice one's faith. And the city upon the hill was very influential with the development of the New England colonies. And if you look at the development of those early colonies in New England, a lot of them stem from religion. Not only Massachusetts Bay, but also Connecticut and New Hampshire and Rhode Island. A lot of them even broke off from originally Massachusetts Bay and formed on their own for religious purposes. These aren't the only groups that are coming. Obviously, they're English. Pilgrims and Puritans are English and they're Protestant. But there are other religious groups that are coming in as well that you should be aware of. For example, William Penn and Quakers were settling in Pennsylvania during this time period, in the colonial period. You also have, originally, you've got Roman Catholics, which are settling in Maryland. Okay, under Lord Baltimore. And in Virginia and some of the maybe more southern colonies, you see a heavy presence of the Anglican Church or the Church of England. So there were a lot of people who weren't necessarily coming to America for the purposes of religion, but they were bringing over the dominant religion of England at the time, which was the Anglican Church or the Church of England, to the colonies and still practicing their faith here. Okay, and then you also have Jewish communities that are forming in areas where there were greater religious tolerance. So, for example, in Rhode Island, where Roger Williams had established a policy of religious toleration, you did have a Jewish community forming. And so this is just a sampling of some of the different religions. This isn't by any means all of them, but it's a sampling of some of the religious diversity that existed in America really from the start. And that's important for us to note because America was such a diverse place in terms of religion. There was a lot more toleration in America towards religion than we see in other places around the world. Now, that is by no means tolerant based off of, for example, the way that we view religion today. But at least for the era, like people were way more tolerant of different religious groups. And we see that in a number of different places, like Rhode Island, Pennsylvania themselves had like policies of greater religious toleration. You had the Maryland acts of religious toleration that stem from the fact that Maryland had a Catholic population and a Protestant population. And so there was a greater religious tolerance early on. It is important to note that despite obviously some of the greater religious tolerance, by far the overwhelming and dominant religious beliefs within the colonies tended to be Protestant. And so you have to understand that for the most part, most of these founding religions, as much as there might be some differences between them, did see themselves as Protestant. It's also during this time period of the founding of the colonies that we see different colonies having established churches. And established churches were churches that basically gained support or funding from the state governments or the colonial governments themselves. And so, for example, the established church in Virginia was the Anglican Church or the Church of England. In New England, if you go to Massachusetts Bay, the Congregationist Church was the established church. And so there were established churches during this time period. Now, so we've got like the founding of all these different, I guess, religious ideas that are coming into America as different groups of people come into America. And it's in this colonial period that we start to see one of the first major religious revivals in American history that we need to be aware of in this class. And it starts really in the 1730s, and we call this religious revival known the First Great Awakening. And the First Great Awakening was a religious revival that tried to kind of re-emphasize the importance of religion within the lives of the people of the colonies. So we want to talk a little bit about why this happened, and then we'll talk about some of the important and lasting effects of this religious revival, because it's not just affecting the way that people think about religion, think about their faith. It's also affecting the way that they see the world. It's affecting the culture of the colonies. It's even affecting America's political development. So the First Great Awakening is caused by a number of things. One of the things that it's caused by is transatlantic trades or transatlantic exchanges. Oops. And what I mean by that is that the transfer of goods between the old world, which was Europe and Africa, and the new world, which was the Caribbean and America, did not end with just items and goods. It also included ideas. And it's during this time period that we see people bring over ideas, specifically religious ideas, into the colonies. So coming over to America were English Protestant preachers like George Whitefield. And George Whitefield was really important in spreading some of the ideas that would make up the First Great Awakening. In addition to these transatlantic exchanges, you also had the First Great Awakening happening as a response to the Enlightenment. Now, I'm going to say this is a very common misconception that students have. I have a lot of students tell me all the time, they think the Enlightenment is the same as the First Great Awakening. And I cannot stress the importance of understanding that they are not. They're very, very different movements, and in some ways they are acting against one another. So the Enlightenment stresses like the concepts of like reason, using your mind to kind of fix problems in society. And the Enlightenment was pioneered by John Locke, and it's going to be incredibly influential in the colonies before the American Revolution and even after. The First Great Awakening, in many ways, is a backlash to the Enlightenment. It's about, instead of kind of exploring the world through your mind and through reason, instead exploring it through your heart and your feelings and your faith. And so the First Great Awakening, in many ways, is a reaction against the Enlightenment. And we want to make sure that we don't confuse those two ideas together. Okay, there's also kind of feelings at this time period within the colonies that religion was on the decline. By 1730s, the dream of the city upon a hill within Puritan New England was over. The city. And there was a sense that religion was just becoming less important to the lives of the colonists and to the lives of the people, especially considering there were some colonies that had been founded specifically for religion. And so this was a major concern for some people. And so the First Great Awakening is an attempt to bring people back to religion. Okay, so it's going to be spread by preachers, specifically, like I said, George Whitefield, but also Jonathan Edwards. And what the message of the First Great Awakening, which is about rediscovering your faith, has some significant impacts or significant effects on colonial society that's going to take us into the American Revolution. And so some of the things that come from or effects of the First Great Awakening are the following. The first thing is that it makes people start to become, think about religion in new ways. So prior to this time period, you had what eventually became known as Old Lights. And Old Lights, were kind of from that kind of an old tradition of kind of absorbing and thinking about religion, in which religion was about you would attend church, and you would often go through these long sermons that were almost like intellectual exercises. And as I said before, the First Great Awakening was about faith more as a feeling, and so there was this emphasis to I guess make it something that was more in line with people's feelings and emotions, and we see kind of this practice becoming used by people that refer to themselves as New Lights. And so there's this kind of split between Old Lights and New Lights as a result of the First Great Awakening. We also see, in general, a decrease in the power of the ministers throughout this time period, because one of the things that the First Great Awakening emphasizes is the importance of people for themselves, reading the Bible for themselves, studying it on their own, and kind of interpreting the Bible on their own. And so it kind of gives way to necessarily more people kind of just reading it for themselves, thinking for themselves. And what that does is it decreases the power of the ministers who had been before that the center of religious learning at that time period. So it decreased the power of ministers as people began to study the Bible on their own. Now, please do not misinterpret the me saying that ministers are decreasing with the idea that religion is decreasing. Religious, like faith, is increasing during this time period. That's what makes it a revival. It's just that that increase is not necessarily centered on one specific church or one specific faith, but just rather in the study of religion as a whole. It also helps create a new national culture within the colonies. So the colonies were, for the most part, very separate from one another. And what we see, what's important about the First Great Awakening is that it unites the colonists under one shared cultural experience. And that shared cultural experience is important in kind of bringing the colonies together as we get closer to the next era, which is the era of the Revolution. Speaking of the era of the Revolution, another very important effect of the First Great Awakening is that it emphasized the importance of thinking for yourself. By decreasing the power of the ministers, the First Great Awakening challenged people to challenge authority and, like I said, think for themselves about religion. Well, obviously, thinking for yourself about religion could also extend to thinking for yourself about government. And so it's during this time period that, like, the First Great Awakening is leading to changes in attitudes about authority. I'm going to put taught people to question authority. And think for themselves. And like these ideas of having a shared cultural experience and questioning authority and thinking for yourself were something that's going to obviously carry over into this next time period, which is the era of the American Revolution. And so when we talk about the First Great Awakening, the First Great Awakening is really important because it helps us at least understand some of the philosophies that are going to lay the groundwork for the revolutionary period. Now, the Enlightenment is also going to be influential during this time period, but once again, understanding that they're influencing the American Revolution, same outcome, America getting its independence, but they're influencing it in different ways. And one's a religious perspective, which is what the First Great Awakening is about, and the Enlightenment is more of a scientific and philosophical perspective. So that takes us into the American Revolution. And the American Revolution, while not a religious revival, I want to talk about it because it certainly had a lot to do with religion. And there's a lot of things that come out during the American Revolution that stem from the First Great Awakening. So because of the religious diversity that existed in the past, and because of a number of other things, that what we see during the American Revolution is we start to see the government kind of taking a stance on religion that is going to set us up for our views on religion even to this day. So a lot of the founding fathers did not wish to establish a official religion for the United States. And so it's during the revolutionary period, as the United States is forming its own government, that we start to see America emerging as a secular society, kind of like the way that we think of it right now. So it's during the revolutionary period, for example, that we see a lot of individual states doing away with established churches. Now, established churches had been churches that were funded by the government of that colony during this time period and would have been funded by the state themselves. And so we see a lot of states, not immediately, this actually continues throughout, this is a gradual process, but a lot of states do away with the established churches like we see in, say, other countries around the world where there's an officially sanctioned religion by the government. So the government's not necessarily sanctioning one specific religion, and they're starting to kind of take a stance of what we call separation of church and state, which is a phrase that we use a lot today. We also see that with the creation of the Constitution itself by 1787. As part of the deal to ratify the Constitution, there is the passage of the Bill of Rights. It's one of the first things that gets passed after the Constitution takes into effect. And in that, one of the first Bill of Rights is the creation of the First Amendment. And the establishment of the First Amendment is protections for religious freedom in the United States. Okay, and so out of the First Amendment, it basically says two things. It protects against the establishment of an official religion, basically meaning that there will never be a specifically sanctioned church for the United States of America, although historically, because of who developed or how America had developed up to this time period, a majority of the country still does remain Protestant. And it also creates this free exercise of religion, meaning that it allows for the exercise and practice of many different religions within the United States. And so obviously this is coming from the history of the United States before this time period. Some of these religious revivals are playing an important role in the thinking that's going into religion and the development of the United States in this time, in this era. So the next thing we want to talk a little bit about is we want to talk about the next religious revival. So America is established, and that's not to say that religion doesn't play a role in this time period, but we can't talk about all of religion, so we want to, like I said, focus on these religious revivals. And the next major religious revival that we want to make sure that we know about is the Second Great Awakening, which happens in 1820. And I don't want to say 1820 exactly. It's in the 1820s that it really starts to happen. It's kind of a movement that evolves over time, and it's ongoing. But you got the Second Great Awakening that's emerging in the 1820s into the 1830s, and it's going to be really super influential in early American history. So just like we're looking at the First Great Awakening, we want to talk a little bit about what defines the Second Great Awakening and what is coming out of it. All right, so the first thing we want to know is that in many ways, the Second Great Awakening is, just like the First Great Awakening, a reaction to the Enlightenment. So there were a lot of religious leaders and people that felt that America's movement away from established churches towards a more secular society, that this was a threat to faith. And so in the Second Great Awakening, this religious revival, this attempt to make religion more important, it is in some ways a response to the American Revolution and the secularism of the new government that was emphasized through the Enlightenment and the passage of things like the First Amendment and so on. So let's put that down. It's a reaction to the American Revolution, specifically the Enlightenment, and secularism of our new government. So that's one thing. So concern that our society is losing its faith is going to lead to a big part of why there's going to be another religious revival in America at this time period. Another thing that's going to be impacting this religious revival is fear of the loss of morality that's coming about because of major changes that are happening in the early 1800s. So in the early 1800s, there's the market revolution that's happening. And on top of that, we're seeing major changes to morality that's caused by a society that's transforming itself for the first time into a more industrial society, okay? Especially like the rise of the earliest cities. Okay, so as people start to leave farms and take factory jobs, as like women go to work in textile mills like the Lowell mills, as we start to see people group themselves in cities, there are people that look around and say, well, in these cities, we're seeing like higher rates of, for example, crime, drinking, prostitution, that like we need to like that they're losing the tighter like community of like in rural America that would naturally protect people from immorality. And so during the Second Great Awakening, there is a drive to try to like protect morality within America, even as it changes, like at the start of the 1800s. So what are some ways that we see the Second Great Awakening affecting American society? Second Great Awakening is super important to understanding the early 1800s for a number of reasons. First of all, it leads to a new growth of revivalism. So there is attempts to spread religion, and like those attempts are very successful. Like there's a greater amount of religion spreading onto like the Western frontier. So you've got like ministers like Charles Finney, who's preaching in like on the frontiers of New York. But you also have like not only the frontier seeing religious revivals, but there's also a greater spread of religious values into like the Deep South. So I'm going to put Western frontier here and Deep South. Religious values spreading into the Western frontier and the Deep South. I'm going to zoom in here so we can see this a little bit better. There we go. Okay. Now, there's other things. We also see the establishment of new religions, just like in the First Great Awakening. The Second Great Awakening isn't going to lead to less religions. It's going to lead to more because it encourages people to find faith, but it doesn't necessarily designate a specific religion as the right faith. You know, and so people express their religious belief by joining a number of different churches, and we even see new churches being formed. So during this time period, we've got new religions emerging. Like during this time period, you've got like the growth of Mormonism. You also see millennialism. You see a number of different congregations growing and spreading. And so like this is also happening during this time period as new religions are formed, not less. We also, and this is in terms of like overall our society, we see some major changes is that we see the rise of new reform movements as a result of the Second Great Awakening. So one of the things that comes out of the Second Great Awakening is this belief that Americans and just people in general should try to better themselves. They should seek to try to make themselves, like perfect themselves, to improve their lives, and that people can make positive changes for themselves. And so out of this, we see a whole host of reform movements that are designed to try to improve the lives of people. And that includes things like the temperance movement. Which seeks to like end drinking as something that's immoral. We also see like the increase of moral education. Okay, and like emphasizing morality within public schools. We teach like all of a sudden like it's during this time period you got like McGuffey readers, which would teach kids how to like read and write, but through like moral education, through moral stories. You've got like the birth of the asylum movement. which sought to improve the lives of and reform, for example, prisoners, as well as people who were deaf, blind, and so on. There's also probably the most important reform movement that comes from this time period, though, was the abolitionist movement. Now, the abolitionist movement wasn't created by the Second Great Awakening, but it changed the way that the abolitionist movement thought about slavery. So there would always been an abolitionist movement in the United States, and there had been attempts to end slavery, like that goes back, during the American Revolution and even before that. But most of the arguments around slavery before this time period had centered on economic questions, not necessarily moral questions. And so what the Second Great Awakening does is it kind of changes the debate over slavery to a moral question. Is slavery right or is it wrong? Is it moral or not? Is it a sin? And radical abolitionists who emerge during this time period, like William Lloyd Garrison, they're arguing that slavery is a sin, that it's morally wrong. And because it's morally wrong, because it's not an economic question, it's a moral question, it needs to be eliminated immediately. And so this gives birth to the radical abolitionist movement. Now there's other effects that we're going to see into the 1840s and into the 1850s. So you're going to see, obviously, the Second Great Awakening support something called Manifest Destiny, which had a religious element to it. Because Manifest Destiny believed that America was destined by God to spread from the East Coast to the West Coast. And so obviously those feelings of that religious support for westward expansion, a lot of it comes from the revival that was happening in this early time period. And there's also going to be growing concerns and a backlash against immigrants in the 1840s. Backlash to old immigrants. Now, old immigrants were immigrants from Western Europe. And what's happening is in the 1840s especially, a large number of immigrants who were coming in were not necessarily Protestant. There's a large number of Irish Catholics that were coming into this country. And so they're going to experience a backlash because a growing number of people within America starts to see Catholicism as a threat to the Protestant values that had been, for the most part, dominant within America up until this time period. And so we see groups like the Know Nothing Party emerge as part of that backlash to especially Irish Catholics that are coming over after the Irish potato famine in the 1840s. So obviously the Second Great Awakening has a huge impact on our society. It's not just a religious impact, but it's also a cultural impact. It's also a political impact. So that takes us to our next era. So we've got the Civil War is going to happen in 1861, 1865. And after the Civil War, the United States is going to go through some major changes as a country. As America transforms after the Civil War from a agricultural society into an industrial society, these major changes, these upheavals, are going to lead to also changes in religion. And so by 1880, we've got our third religious revival that we want to be aware of. And that third religious revival is known as, I'm going to zoom in here, the social gospel movement. So the social gospel movement is, just like the other revivals, it's trying to emphasize the importance of religion in society. And the social gospel movement is especially trying to take religious values and try to apply them to what's happening in society, especially in urban areas and cities. And so people who are involved in the social gospel want to take religious values like helping of the poor, for example, and apply them to the changes that they're seeing in response to, and this is what's causing this, industrialization, immigration, and urbanization. So it's a response to the second industrial revolution. The massive growth of cities, and the poverty that existed in those cities. Let's see here. And finally, the new wave of immigrants who were coming in at this time period, who were now new immigrants coming from countries that hadn't typically come to the United States before this time period. And so these radical changes that our country was experiencing in the late 1800s kind of gives rise to this new revival, which is going to last and be prominent even up till really through the Great Depression into World War II. So I saw the social gospel movement is emphasizing like applying religious values to some of the problems that Americans are seeing in society because of these changes. So what are the effects that we see as a result of the social gospel movement? Well, just like in previous time periods, this third religious revival is not necessarily just contained to religion and faith. It's going to affect all parts of society. So the social gospel movement is really important because it leads to new major movements in American society, which are designed to try to provide for the poor and also help protect morality. So one movement that comes out of the social gospel movement is, for example, the settlement house movement. And the settlement movement is a great example of kind of the beliefs of the social gospel movement. The settlement movement, probably best exemplified by Jane Addams and Hull House, was about trying to provide help to people that were living in urban slums. And so it addressed the needs of many poor Americans living in cities, especially in this case in Chicago, but also a lot of those people living in poverty tended to be recent immigrants. And so Jane Addams, through her Hull House, tried to reach out and create educational programs and provide better lives for people. We also see through organizations during this time period and charities that kind of also fulfill the ideas of the social gospel. The YMCA, Young Men's Christian Association, the establishment of the Salvation Army, these charities that are trying to provide help and relief to people as an extension of this religious movement. There's also a huge impact in more like specifically political movements during this time period. So it inspired a greater emphasis on improving morality. That's one of the big things that the social gospel movement did. So it's going to try to create more improved morality within American society. Once again, there was fears of what was happening to American morality as a result of industrialization. Once again, there was higher crime rates. There was concern over, like I said, alcohol again. So it's during this time period we're going to see a revival in the temperance movement and prohibition. There is also going to be concerns over, like I said, a number of different things from like gangs and kids being on the street by themselves to like eventually murder and even prostitution. And so there's attempts to try to fix this. And we see this especially in the creation of the progressive movement. So the progressive movement wanted to fix the problems of industrialization. And one of their big goals was to foster moral improvement. And so, like, you can see, like, they want kids off the street, and we want compulsory attendance laws, for example. They want to clean up corruption in government and through political machines. The temperance movement was established as part of this religious revival. And then lastly, I'm just going to talk about is cultural imperialism. Okay, and so imperialism happens around 1898 with the Spanish-American War, and it's during this time period that for some religious leaders, religion is used as a justification for us going over and imperializing other countries, believing that America is spreading its religious values overseas, and that's what's justifying us taking over the Philippines, for example, after the Spanish-American War. A good example of cultural imperialism is like the teachings of people like Josiah Strong. Okay, now embedded in all of this, and just kind of one final point that I want to make. Okay, it's a continuity throughout these religious movements. So let's just, there we go. Okay. So these are like the three revivals during this time period. And I want to just make one other really, really important point about these religious revivals. Historically, throughout American history, if you kind of go all the way back to like the American Revolution and something called the Republican motherhood, women had historically been considered to be the caretakers of morality within American society. And we see that during the American Revolutionary period, and we see that like beyond, even into like the ideas of like the cult of domesticity during this time period and so on. And so because women had primarily been viewed in society as the protectors of morality within American history, like these religious revivals also had another effect in oftentimes like giving women more voice within society and allowing women to become leaders and to make gains for rights. So, like, for example, during the Second Great Awakening, it is not a coincidence that not only is there a temperance movement, which many women were like part of the groups pioneering that, as part of the asylum movement. You got Dorothea Dix, you've got the Grimke sisters in the abolitionist movement, but you also have an entirely new movement, the women's rights movement or first wave feminism, coming out of this time period as well. So that by the end of this time period, you've got the Seneca Falls Convention. In this later time period, once again, women are some of the leaders who are pioneering and kind of making the push for improved morality. Jane Addams is probably the one that comes to mind. Out west, you've got Mary Lease, who's a member of, who's very active in the Women's Christian Temperance Union for temperance. And then, of course, like this movement in reform is going to also help lead to the pioneering of more rights for women, so that by the end of World War I, you've got the passage of the 19th Amendment, which give women more political power and give them the right to vote. So religion is going to be really important in our society, not just from a cultural and even religious perspective, but also from overall, it's going to be shaping the way that America develops in the periods that we have to know for our tests. So